All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And it was wonderful to see some familiar names from last session. So thank you so much. Folks who weren't here last time, hope you were able to watch the video, the recording of it, because it was wonderful. Thank you, Ben, for sharing the link. He also posted it on YouTube too, which is much more accessible than what I had in Canvas. In that. So anyways, so yeah, we are here for our second session with Ben. So really excited to learn more about art and how we could use it in essentially our daily lives, right? Not just in our teaching and our profession, but how does it help expound our own boundaries and how we think about how we interact with other human beings. So art as a teaching tool, and teaching, we use the term very loosely in the sense, again, it's not just about the classroom. It's about how to inspire and empower students / people in general to address important issues. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Ben.
Great, thank you, Suming. And yeah, this has been a really interesting experience. I've taught on the college level for over 20 years, and I never sort of sat down and thought about, okay, like how is this information being shared and delivered, and what are ways to improve that, and how has that evolved over time? So assuming if you wouldn't mind just sort of monitoring the chat in case people have questions, or if you have questions during the talk, please feel free to share them. I'll be happy to address them and just have a kind of informal conversation about this. So just to recap and give a little bit of a bird's eye view, this development series started last week with the art, visual literacy, and skill building in an AI-driven world, and that link is in the chat. So you could watch that on our YouTube page, and this will be recorded as well if you want to watch it again. Today we're going to look at art as a tool for teaching, and like Suming said, this has much greater application in our wider experience, and it could be used just for kind of thinking about culture, thinking about kind of social political context, thinking about aesthetics, and even thinking about our personal expression. And so we may not finish the amount of information I have to share this session, and then I'll spill over into the next session, which will be much more interactive. So we're going to use different tools of AI, not only to generate some ideas for the classroom and different exercises, but also you're going to make your own art. And it's actually quite easy and very impactful to use some of the AI tools. I'm a Google person, as I mentioned last time, and so I'll be using Gemini, but feel free to use whatever feels the most comfortable for you in terms of that. But it's really about thinking about what the stakes are, what are some decisions, what is your taste, and how do you reach your audience in terms of art. So we'll think about all those different things. So today we're going to look at overall skill sets and touching on the skill sets I introduced last time and thinking about how that transitions into a wider set of outcomes. Then I'm going to share some learning models, and these are informal learning models. These are ones I self-generated. There are some sort of formal applicable learning models that I've referenced, but overall they're kind of open-ended and related to things in my own experiences teaching that I want to share with you. Then we're going to apply those learning models to artwork. And then if there's time today, we're going to start developing coursework using AI, but more likely that'll be something for next session. I want to give around 10, 15 minutes today for a Q&A at the end. So I'll talk for about 45 minutes. But again, feel free to ask any questions or share any ideas as I'm doing this presentation. So quick recap. Again, last time I shared how in our MFA program, we really think about the artist as a creative entrepreneur. And this is someone who is not only making art, but communicating with the world, communicating verbally. We want our students to be good writers so they can advocate. It's expected that artists can write well, write press releases, write artist statements, write proposals for exhibitions, etc. It's expected that they have a kind of public persona, that they speak well. It's expected that they have a good website where you can see all their work and it's been very clearly shared. So even kind of personal advocacy and personal marketing is a big thing. It's also expected artists have good Instagram sites and have a kind of social media life as well. So all those elements I would think of as being very entrepreneurial. And so I want to think about that space. And given who we are and how the sort of porosity between who we are as teachers, who we are as citizens, who we are in our personal lives is opening more and more with social media and other engagements. Um, it's important to think about how these skill sets that were defined last session as the top skill sets of 2025, as said by the World Economic Forum, are dynamic and adaptive. So we're looking at a world ahead of us. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of kind of disruptions, a lot of lack of stability or expectation. And so these skill sets are really keeping that in mind as technology changes, as social and political context change. These might be the skills our students are using for the next generation to really cope and adapt and thrive and be empowered. So I think about that a lot. And in terms of art, a lot of that can be translated into that. So here's the image I'm going to be talking about more in depth later, but right now, as this sort of first point of contact, without any context, a major artwork like this fulfills all of those skill sets. There's a lot of innovation and analytical thinking to make this. In order to produce it, there's a lot of learning and problem solving, critical thinking and analysis to sort of understand the context. It's very original and creative. The artists can't make it themselves, so they have to kind of manage a larger project, which means that they're employing leadership and project development skills. They're working with the museum. They're working with, a lot of fabricators. There's technology use. Here, there's one aspect of this which is interactive. And there's one that has a kind of unique design scenario. So we can even think of that as being a new programmatic approach to technology. There's a kind of kinetic and mechanical piece to it. But also, there's a high level of failure in something like this. So we think of that as being resilient, stress tolerance, and just kind of general reasoning and ideation. So I think all of those are built into the kind of production and thinking about this piece, which we'll touch upon a little bit later. But in thinking about our students and thinking about our lives, as citizens, here are some outcomes I wanted to address that lead towards those skill building scenarios. So this means how in the classroom we can think about creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, emotional intelligence, critique, engagement, and trust with our students, leadership, project management, research, self-expression, and social justice. So how can all of these elements be part of the classroom, which could lead to the skill building, but also are recognized in that artwork I shared with you before? And not to be too deep into wider professional outcomes, but we are the School of Professional Studies, so we think a lot about those professional outcomes. And being back into the kind of ecosystem of Google, they did a self-analysis project called Aristotle. This is in 2016, and they're like, well, what are the keys to build a successful team? And we can think about our students working collaboratively in the classroom and maybe in their kind of long-term element. And certainly here at Clark, we're working together as a team and under many auspices. And so the sort of foundation of that they found is psychological safety, right? How can the team members work and try things and be vulnerable and be open? And most things we try don't quite work. So there's going to be a high failure rate. And so how can there be a scenario, and I highlight in green, to kind of create that? Second is dependability, which I would think as being trust building, confidence in others, leadership, collaboration, etc. In yellow is structure and clarity. So how can we have creativity, clarity, critical thinking, and kind of strong research methodologies? And then finally, the red, which they said meaning of work, to me feels the same as the impact. And so, how can folks feel like their work is important, has meaning and impact? And so we can ascribe that to self-expression and personal meaning, as well as social justice and empathy. So all those sort of ingredients are there. And we can see how those ingredients might be in this artwork as well, which we will spend a little bit more time with later. But I just want to set the table a little bit and maybe provide a little bit of a foundation for our thinking. And not to lean too heavily into the tech world, because again, they're very kind of problematic sites and something like Amazon, which maybe is a piece of cognitive dissonance, right? Is Amazon a net positive for our culture? It's hard to say definitively. And I think that messiness of cognitive dissonance, which is, holding multiple points of view, which might be valid and it might be in direct opposition to one another, is messy, right? So if we hold like views that may not be aligned together, but they all have a certain level of validity, how do we hold that space and how do we hold the space of innovation, which is often quite messy? So I saw a podcast with Jeff Bezos, which was again fascinating, super complicated, and very discouraging in some ways, but also very fascinating in other ways. And he talked a lot about the value of wandering and meandering. And, to be innovative, you have to get to a place you don't expect. And so, one thing I want to share from the onset is that, creativity is messy, creativity is not predictable. And often institutions are defined by predictable outcomes and insurance against risk, right? So we see this a lot in things like Hollywood movies or, pop music, where they try to impose a formula that they think will have, X amount of popularity. But how do we kind of embrace wandering in order to get somewhere we don't quite know? And how to kind of hold that space. And it's a space of curiosity, and there's potential for great value because it's a space of true innovation and creativity and the unknown. Secondly, much like Google was mentioning, how do you create an environment which feels safe for folks to have true discourse in a meaningful and rigorous way? So Amazon actually, their meetings are well known for having 6-page memos. People have to write out the memos, print them out, and in the meetings, people will sit together and sit there in silence for 30 minutes and read everything. Because the idea is that a lot of weak ideas can be boosted by, visual, data and PowerPoints. And so you can use a lot of very seductive aesthetic tools to make weak points seem stronger than they are. And so that's why they have a very kind of flat reading, very dry. And then once they have the memo, they're able to have these wide open discussions because everyone is on the same page. This jumps to the next two parts, which is how do you have these discussions which are open-ended? You can have dissenting opinions. You can have controversy, which is respectful, but people can have differing opinions. So instead of having a hierarchical-based conversation, and even in the bottom one, the most junior person speaks first, right? So he, as a CEO, speaks last, and then people speak based off, reverse hierarchy. And so that way they're not influenced by their own bosses. So they're able to speak openly and have these open discussions, and really feel trust that their ideas are being heard, and then they're not being there's a kind of fostering of that kind of openness and intimacy. So I wanted to think about that in terms of models of learning and teaching. Again, I've made these up myself. These images are AI. This one is particularly wooden, but let's ignore that. And so how can we take some of those ideas into the classroom and thinking about a creative and entrepreneurial based form of learning, which is A, open-ended. People don't know quite where they're going to go. Number two, to create a third space. So something that's not about the what is at hand, but making something else. So maybe in Google and Amazon's world, they're making a kind of software product, right? Or they're some other kind of user experience there, which is not what's happening in the classroom or in the office meeting, but something else. And so art can occupy that space. Let us make something, a project, some kind of physical outcome, which is different, but addresses a lot of the ideas that we're dealing with. How can we have meandering discourse in a space of trust and rigor and openness? And how can some of this learning be either personal and self-directed or collaborative, right? And so how do we build our team building skills? Another one is like inquiry-based learning. And again, these can all fit together in a meaningful way. But how do we do research? And what does research look like? Is research something you've seen in person? Is research something you're using the internet or books or articles? Or they could be an aesthetic structure that you personally like. that you want to explore further. And so how can you have different forms of personal or artistic research, explore those, ask questions, investigate, and experiment. So even in that large piece that we saw, there's a tremendous amount of material research, right? What is the right material to use to make this thing happen? What is the right way for people to sort of move around it? Does it feel right at a certain scale? What are the right colors? Those are all forms of research that we can think about. Next, we can think about social justice. Clark is really foregrounding social justice in many of the programs. And I think one really important element of that is it gives students a real sense of meaning and personal expression, that they are doing something that has enormous impact, much like the top of the pyramid in that Google chart. How do you know the work you're doing has important personal, social, cultural impact? Then you also have research which we can call intersectional. So how can we do research to look at social justice-based topics that deal with different points of view that maybe decenter, the Western point of view or even decenter the human point of view? And then how do we think about community interaction in that? So how can students build their sort of resilience in communication and interpersonal communication? And folks have talked of that as being a huge deficit since COVID, and students are much more wedded to sort of digital forms or passive forms of communication, but to have them immersed in something so they are building their skills to talk to a wide variety of people seems important and related to this third part, which is experience-based learning. So in doing some just quick research, a 2021 University of Tokyo study found that participants had a 25% better recall when they wrote information by hand than by typing. And then the University of Waterloo in 2019 said that folks had a more than double the recall when drawing versus writing it down, right? So these are just different ways to sort of explain information for themselves. So sometimes it's a mind map, other times it's a Venn diagram, other times, there's many mechanisms to record information. But one we can think about is experience-based learning. So what happens if you go somewhere, if you bring students somewhere, and then what information do they gain and recall and value based off that experience? I remember I took freshman year at Cal Berkeley, I took a microbiology class, and the only thing I remember from that class, which is 1995, 30 years ago, is that we took a field trip to a brewery, to the Anchorstein Brewery, so we could understand a lot of what was happening microbiologically at the brewery, right? I don't remember anything else that happened in that class, or even much of what happened in that semester freshman year, but I do remember that experience. So there's something about the imprint and the kind of core memories that experiences often give us that are tactile, interactive, and kind of stay with us. Again, these are all AI images. And thinking about learning styles, this is from David Kolb's Experiential Learning Theory from 1984. So he looks at four kinds of learning styles. And so again, this is quite neat, and there might be more layers and complexities here, but I think it's a good place to start. And so his four ways of thinking in terms of learning are diverging, feel and watch, assimilating, think and watch. So those are both sort of more passive and reflective ways of getting information. And on the other side is converging, think and do versus feel and do, accommodating feel and do. And those are much more experimental. So in the middle of that is experience, and also conceptualization. But there's an interesting dynamic to really parse out if students are feeling, watching, or thinking, or like what combination of that is happening relating to any assignments or school-based projects. And on top of that, as they learn, this cycle I thought was quite interesting, again from Kolb. The concrete experience, you have an actual experience, then you have the observation of that, then you think about that and analyze it. We can call abstract conceptualization. And then there's active experimentation, trying out what you have learned, putting that into practice, which leads directly to that concrete experience again. So this sort of cyclical function of learning, parsing out these four different aspects. So the next question is, how do we use art in service of these models? And so thinking back to this here, you see this very large Installation, you see red thread, you see what looks like paper, you can understand the scale, you can see that there's furniture there and there's a viewer and the scale of the viewer. Um, and now we have a name for it. It's called homeless home, right? So now there's a little bit of context. Homeless home. What does it mean to have a home? What does it mean to not have a home? Less home? Then here's the artist, Chiharu Shiota. Her name sounds Japanese. Again, that gives a context. She's born in Osaka in 1972. And this is the description of this: an enormous field of red and black ropes forming the shape of a house. Within this symbolic form, Kyoto suspends paper documents, passports, letters, immigration papers, messages, and embeds beds, desks, chairs, and tables to underscore how people create their homes through communication, stories, and objects. Together, these transporting works will consider the journey towards one home and away from another. So again, now we have even more ground to stand on, even more context to understand this artwork. And then if we look, it's actually up now. So it opened, 2 months ago in May, and it closes 5 weeks from now in September 1st. And where is it? It is at the ICA watershed in East Boston. So as the crow flies, that's probably an hour's distance from Worcester. So this could be a feasible thing for folks in the greater Worcester area to check out. It's actually free, so it's really open to everyone. So I wanted to really foreground an artwork which is very accessible, either physically or just sort of mentally. You're like, oh, if this is not too far from where I am, you feel a different closeness with this. If this was shown in Tokyo, you wouldn't have that same affinity psychically necessarily. So in describing this, this is again is getting deeper layers into what this artwork is. This is from a New York Times article from May. Shiota's immigrant story, both personal and age-old, echoes those of many residents living in East Boston near the shipyard, once the second largest point of immigration in the United States after Ellis Island. Earlier this spring, the ICA distributed a flyer asking the local community to consider Kyoto's open-ended questions: what home means, what it feels like to leave home, and what it takes to rebuild it. Their personal stories, photographs, drawings, and documents were reproduced on the sheets of white paper, animating her installation. So again, now we have a bridge to the local community. We have something that's experiential. We have different forms of research. This is maybe a community-based research. This is finding high-value documents that relate to that community's lived experience, embracing wider open questions about home, but also immigration and migration. Also from the article, Shiota has created a winding pathway through the heart of her project, and viewers can see at close range, what's printed on the fluttering sheets of paper. There are photographs of airport reunions, children playing on front lawns, a Venezuelan's first experience of snow in Boston. One person offered a recipe for apple dumplings. A child's drawing of a house includes a handwritten line: "Home is all the important people who make the life better, makes the life better." A woman contributing her own falsified adoption papers, deeming her an orphan, with the accompanying message: "May all Korean adoptees find their way back home." So again, home becomes this very kind of large proxy for a lot of different forms of input, and this input can be collected and shared within this wider structure called an artwork. And so you see a lot of this equation of how one experiences learning here. And maybe this is also a form of learning, though it's not the same as like didactic or academic learning, but it's a way to form a deep experience that creates observation, that creates some kind of conceptualization for the viewer. And then maybe it also invites them to do their own experimentation in that upper quadrant, the orange quadrant. That's maybe where teaching can come in really powerfully as well, right? How can students distill a lot of these parameters and translate that into their own experimentation within the classroom? While none of Shioto's work is overtly political, this idea of where one makes one's home and what the connections are to a place could never be more at the forefront of our minds, says Ruth Erickson, chief curator at the ICA Boston, and she curated the show. And she goes, we see a country and an administration really analyzing those rights. And so thinking about what home means, and even over the course of this exhibition, and for something this large, it takes years of development and organization and preparing. But, here the work is up now. in a very resonant moment in our country, with a very kind of challenging idea of what different folks think of as home, or who is welcome and unwelcome in this country, and what connections and disconnections are being amplified as a result. And so thinking now we look at this image with all that context and we have a very, very different read, right? So we see people moving through, we understand what the furniture might mean, we understand what a bed might mean, and even this sort of network of string that holds things and suspends at the same time could also be a kind of cage, right? It could be an obstacle. It could be something where you're able to walk through, but you're not able to actually get to the furniture. You can't get to a place of rest, but you're able to see around you all these things in motion, all these sort of pieces of paper that reflect the diverse experience of many, many people in the kind of wider community surrounding this museum. So how do we translate this into the classroom? So here is an artwork that has many layers and dimensions. And so I thought of this idea of analyze, research, create, ARC, ARC. Again, I've made this up myself. There's no sort of formal wider thinking that I'm relating to. This is another component to the show where there are these mechanized and floating suitcases. So as you walk around, the suitcases are moving, giving the sense that there's something inside of them, giving the suitcase a kind of presence and life. There's also a thought that Shiota is responding to objects that have a lot of personal value, and as a result, they kind of have a presence to them, right? Much like if a family member, gave you an object, and it could be a sort of, domestic object, something quite ordinary, but that object is infused with that person. So even like a plant, like a house plant, be like, oh, well, my grandmother gave me that plant. So it's no longer just a plant, it's a plant that embodies a lot of the kind of presence of my grandmother, and I might even, treat it with a kind of respect and devotion there. So thinking about here are three mechanisms to sort of think about this and maybe translate into projects. So we analyze what the major themes are. So we're thinking about home. What does home mean? It's a place of comfort and psychological safety, or not. Folks come from homes which don't have those presence, but how do we analyze what that means? What does that mean in terms of understanding ourselves, or in a wider intersectional method, different folks in the population or globally? What does it mean to have migration? What are the conditions for migration historically, physically? What are barriers to migration? Why do those exist? What are the objects that create presence in terms of this? What is the immersion of this? So the artist wants you to be immersed inside of it. You're not looking at something passive, you're within it and you can see through it. And what are the wider metaphors here? And so I wanted to think also in terms of the three focal points, determined within Clark, climate, environment, and society, media arts, computing, and design, as well as health and human behavior. So we can sort of think about, to ourselves, and this is something we'll work on for our next session, how would we integrate some of these points or some of these sort of academic positions that Clark is really establishing itself in, to think about this work here. So to think about climate, environment, society, that would be one lens to look at this artwork. Media arts, computing, design, because there are a lot of media components to this, and you can imagine that this work was entirely designed like in, 3D modeling program before it's put here. How do we do that? How do we create like different kind of optimization for how people move through it? What are different points of data you can collect about how people stay here? How do we know which part they stayed at the most? What is the most impactful or effective part of it? How do we think about that? How do we think about lighting and how the technology that surrounds this experience? And health and human behavior, again, maybe this points to wider kind of social justice and humanizing components, to have a collection of objects that relate to different human populations. So that's one form of analysis. In terms of research, we can think about how Shiota is looking at this Hokusai Ukiyo-e woodblock print from 1832. This is from his long-term and very well-known project looking at different views of Mount Fuji. And this one has a sort of, airing out of these papers. And again, maybe expressing the relationship of culture and nature. Within that, there's also this kind of meandering path. So there's something very analogous between the way, her work looks like this and his work looks like that. But she also talks about color, the red color having a certain impact and meaning in Japanese culture, and maybe red has different meanings in different cultures globally or historically. What are different points of meaning and context within that? How do we think about access towards home when home is inaccessible? Um, and even in looking at a lot of her references in previous works, she's always making these kinds of networks, right? And what does that mean? Does that mean that this object is something that we can't use, it's lost its use value, but maybe it gains a kind of metaphoric aesthetic value? Her work is very immersive. It's about an entire installation. So maybe for our next session, if you were to create your own Shiota type installation, what are some components that would be important to you? What would be some materials and some colors? When you look at the work, there's a kind of airiness and lightness about it, right? She's choosing materials you could see through, but yet have a kind of binding. So there are a lot of contradictory elements and dynamic elements within the research. And finally, when we think about creation, we can ask ourselves a set of questions. So looking at some of the details within the work and also how the work looks quite different from a distance. When you first step in and see the bigger thing versus when you're approaching the project or you're in the middle of it versus when you're looking at very kind of heightened details within the project. Now you're seeing people's photographs and you think about why they shared this image, why this was important to them, who this little girl might have been, here's some currency, here are some passports, what are the kind of personal narratives within that? And here's another quote from Ruth Erickson, the chief curator at the ICA. Is this idea of where one makes one's home and what the connections are to a place could never be more at the forefront of our minds, right? And so all of us have a relationship with this topic, which is very comprehensive. And so how do you address some of these questions? In your creativity, where do you want to investigate further? What does that look like? What elements stand out? Are you interested, or the classroom or this group interested in different components and in suspension? Or maybe they're interested in things holding things down. Maybe they're more interested in the furniture or things that once had enormous domestic value, but maybe that has transitioned. So what are some elements one wants to highlight or interact with? What is the scope? Is this something that fits on a tabletop? Is this something on the wall? Is this a huge installation? And what materials do you want to kind of work with that? So you ask these questions to sort of start shaping what things might look like. So I gave a AI prompt to Gemini, and my AI prompt was design a classroom project based off the work of Chiharu Shiota. And so here's what AI said. And again, this could help us think about what we want to do for our next session. So brainstorming memory and connection. Lead a discussion on personal memories, connections, and significant objects. And I would imagine, a lot of our international students, right, they are now looking at Clark and Worcester as their home. What are some objects or connections or memories they've brought with them from, where they were born and where they grew up. So this might have a wide impact, regardless of what they're studying, but as people, or to sort of foster connection with the wider Clark community. And so some prompt questions from Gemini: what objects hold special meaning to you and why? What connections do you have to people, places, and events? How do we remember things? How do we connect with others? What does quote unquote absence feel like or look like, right? So when we think about like even the term homesick, again, not necessarily a physical thing, but certainly a psychological and emotional state to sort of miss home. But it's interesting how the terminology is sickness, so that it's become a kind of disease where you might feel physically sick because you're longing for home. Introduce the idea of bringing in objects of memory connection from home, provide guidelines for appropriate objects, small, non-perishable, meaningful. but also maybe one brings a copy of the thing so the original isn't destroyed, and gives students a few days to gather these. So again, this is a prompt. I think AI is really good at giving back another prompt idea, but it's really up to us to sort of refine this. And we can refine it in conversation with each other, in conversation with students, in conversation with Gemini, and kind of asking it to refine over and over again. And so, in terms of an image, I hear my prompt was make an image of student work based off the work of Chiharu Shiota. So this looks more like a high school classroom, but that's fine. So they built something in the classroom, again, using red thread or red and black thread, which are sort of colors that Shiota is using quite regularly. And then you can see different objects hung there, and maybe there's keys and maybe little images or maybe other kind of small mementos that reflect somewhere. But in order to make this happen, in order to find the space for that messy dialogue, so one can meander and one can wander and can get to a new place that's unexpected and therefore exciting and innovative, an atmosphere of trust and rigor has to be created, right? So how can students share something without feeling that they'll be judged or diminished? And again, how can they fail intelligently? I'm a big fan of that Samuel Beckett quote where he says, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, fail again, fail better, right? And most things we try don't work, and that's just part of it, right? It might work 1 out of 20 times, 1 out of 100 times. And I think that's one really exciting thing about art and in most forms of creativity is a sort of shaping of it, right? And so how do we know like this project is the right size? How do we know it has the right tone? Does it have the right sort of impression? Does it have the right scale? Would this work better as separate projects, smaller projects? Would it work better, underneath the table or suspended from the ceiling? How can we, once we have that, have a culture of critique? And I would say in the MFA program, this is such an essential piece of what we do, where it allows students to create trust, to be very vulnerable, because when they're showing their own artwork, they have a lot of personal meaning in it, and they don't want to be in a place where people are harsh and kind of dismissive of it. So we try to really create a form of communication in our critique, which is constructive yet rigorous, right? So no one is, and you are not the art. So, and we say that quite a bit, it's like, how can the art live its own life? And we can critique it and give feedback on it, but it's not insulting the person. And I think these are really strong skills in terms of understanding personal meaning. And one hears a lot about how, a lot of students post-COVID have a lot of difficulty holding uncomfortable conversations, or they're avoidant, or they look to like texting or digital platforms in order to kind of communicate more openly, and they're unable to do that in person comfortably, right? So how can we open up a space which might be a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit vulnerable? Just the other day, I read something from Ocean Vuong, who's a well-known Vietnamese American poet who's been writing, just came out with another book, but been teaching for over 10 years at UMass Amherst and NYU. And he talked about how his students are stuck in a kind of cringe culture. They're afraid to be open. They're afraid to be sincere because of cringe. When someone looks at something and it seems too sincere, too open, too vulnerable, and they're like, oh my goodness, cringe. But there's something very safe about that and very risk averse about that. And so, how do we get to a place where people are willing to be open? And looking back again to these learning cycles, how can they make their own projects? And again, they don't have to be physical. They could be AI-based prompts. They could be kind of just an idea that they maybe have worked with together. But how can we create this kind of cycle of experience, reflection, conceptualization, and experimentation within that? And again, they could be, programming technology. But so much of that is like, how do they do something different? How do they innovate within those different spaces? So, thinking further of that within critique, questions might be what works well in this piece, what needs improvement. One might say, okay, the red thread is great, but it's too dominating, and the black thread needs to come up more, and you need to do more of that. Or maybe there needs to be more variety, that it all has the kind of same networking, and maybe there needs to be areas of density and areas of openness. Maybe the objects are too similar. We can also address what came out different than expected. I thought I was going to do this, and then this other thing came out. And again, we want to challenge expectations. Much like if you're traveling and you went to Paris and your experience is exactly what you expected, there's something a little bit disappointing in that, right? You wanted something different and fresh and new and personal. So how can we be open to that kind of curiosity and creativity and innovation, which is unexpected? And how can you take this further, conceptually, technically, or materially? So we're thinking about that, and how can we also have the right language to really be encouraging of folks to really push their ideas, regardless of what shape they form, to think about that. So in terms of analyzing and responding to this project, maybe now we have a little bit of a stronger idea about these outcomes and how this artwork can really touch upon, these 10 outcomes, which we first shared initially. I have about 5 more minutes, so I'm going to be wrapping up soon. But there are a way that these ideas can kind of come out of this. But I can also imagine within your own classrooms or spaces of teaching or interaction, or just in your sort of personal thinking, how can you amplify some of these skills, thinking about art or other modes of personal and social expression. So I'm just going to leave these 4 other artists, and this is where we're going to start with next Wednesday. These are just 4 other artists, and I want to just give a short prompt, and we can think about them further next week. So not just to put all our eggs in the basket of Chiaro Shiota. And again, you don't have to have an answer yet, but this is something we can further next week. So here are just 4 other contemporary artists, living artists. How would you source their work in your teaching or in terms of your expression or thinking? This is work by Francis Elise. He's Belgian, lives and works in Mexico City. And this is a project done in Kabul, Afghanistan, called Real Unreal. Let me see if this, I'm going to make sure the sharing is going here. So I might have to stop share and then reshare here. So this is shot in 2011. So the US had been occupying Kabul for about 10 years at this point. And what this piece is looking at these kids in the hills of Kabul, and then you see helicopters in the distance, and they're using a reel of cinematic film, and they're using it to play a kind of tire game. Like we've seen the game where kids take a tire and a stick and they push that around, and this is sort of going through Kabul. And then, so you're actually seeing the kind of everydayness of Kabul, which for me, I had never seen before. In all the media we might consume, somehow the media doesn't portray any of this visually. And then ultimately, it rolls off a hill, and it ends with this context about the Taliban confiscating thousands of reels of film from the Afghan film archive in September of 2001 and burned them. And the fire lasted 15 days. But what had happened is that they were given mostly copies, and that the curator of the film archive put copies of films on the shelves and then built a room in the middle of the museum, and then hid all of the originals within that. So they didn't get access to the originals. And so Real Unreal can, again, be, sorry, I need to share PowerPoint again. Here we go. About that, so I just want to introduce that, and we will further that next week. Other works of his include children's games. So this is just a quick um, clip from his website where he goes and films children's games all around the world. So this little section has London, Cuba, Taiwan, Morocco, Ukraine, and he goes to the Congo and he goes to Mexico, which is actually where he's based. And then this is how it was shown at the Venice Biennial in 2022, which is, one of the most prestigious exhibition that happens every other year in Venice. And the Kabul work, Real Unreal, was actually shown at Documenta, which is, again, a very prestigious art exhibition that happens every 5 years. And that particular year, in 2012, it was shown in Kassel, Germany, which is where it typically is shown, as well as in Kabul. So they did a whole section of it in Kabul. And children's games, we can think about that sociologically and politically. It's like how are children sort of thinking about the resources or responding to their current environment and to create games of fun, but you end up learning and finding out a lot more of a wider kind of swatch of what's happening in society, socially and otherwise. Then we'll also look at Hans Hacke, an artist approaching 90, born in Germany. This is a project he did at the Reichstag, which is the German parliament building, in 2000. So a little bit over 10 years after Germany reunifies and the capital moves to Berlin. And he does this project called The Population, which in German, which I don't speak, Der Bevölkerung. And this is a kind of counter to what's happening outside of the Reichstag. It says to the German people. So this is about the entire population, thinking about this Bertolt Brecht quote from 1935 during the Nazi era. In our times, anyone who says, quote, population instead of, quote, people is by that simple act refusing to support a great many lies. And so he builds a garden in the center of the courtyard of the Reichstag and invites the over 200 politicians in the parliament to bring a bag of dirt from their constituency. And then they dump the bag of dirt in the garden and just randomly. And then over the years, the garden grows together and kind of integrates. So it becomes a kind of conversation about integration sourced from different locations in Germany. Last two are American. Amy Sherald, who says, I really have this deep belief that images can change the world. You may know her work from her portrait of Michelle Obama from 2018. And her work kind of continues to really foreground the African American experience, but what is often considered a kind of pleasure activism, right? So to look at the African American body not as a site of being marginalized, but as a site of rest and joy and like grounding. And so you can see that in this painting, 2019, Precious Jewels by the Sea, large format painting. And again, very ordinary for young people at the beach. But again, the kind of content is quite deep and impactful. And she's just had some major exhibitions of mid career survey at SF MoMA last year and earlier this year, and currently at the Whitney Museum right now in New York. And then finally, the work of Jenny Holzer, is a text-based artist, born in Ohio. And, she does text in a whole variety of settings. So in the lower right, this is our on movie theater marquees abandoned in Times Square when Times Square was much more gritty. And the text says, it is in your self-interest to find a way to be very tender. And then other engagements are using the Jumbotron television, 1985 in New York. It says, protect me from what I want. And then on a t-shirt, abuse of power comes as no surprise. And then this, major exhibition at the Guggenheim in New York and using the architecture of the kind of spiral ramp to hold moving LED lights. And then, the text comes in many forms, and this one from 2020 are part of her greater project called Truisms, use what is dominant in the culture to change it quickly. And she has hundreds of truisms at this point. Okay, I am going to stop there and have some conversations for some opportunity for conversations or questions.
Thanks, Ben. That was very interesting. The question is about the ethics of using Gemini and creating these images. I mean, where are we at with these lawsuits? I mean, I haven't been keeping up to date with the ethical part or the legal part of it, both.
Yeah, I think for educational purposes, I feel liberated to do anything, right? So I think, um, and there's no sense that we are reproducing these artworks and for any kind of profit, right? I think we're using them as tools for engagement. And I think where things become tricky is when Gemini is used by kind of powerful institutions to, monetize people's creativity. I think that's the problem is if they, do something, if IKEA starts, finding people's images and maybe making minor changes in Gemini so they can sell like 10,000 versions of them in IKEA, like that's a problem. I think within that, but within the classroom, I feel personally open to use whatever source material is out there. I don't think we're in a space of exploitation. I think we're in a space of education, and our goals are to empower our students. And right now, Gemini functions as a tool. We have no idea how Gemini and other AI platforms will function in the years to come, but I think at present, I feel pretty ethically secure in using Gemini for these purposes. Yeah. Jesse has a question.
Oh, hi. I was wondering what you want us to do for the next meeting, to contextualize this. This is our critique. I do this sort of format a lot in my classes because I'm a theater arts professor, and I'm wondering what you want us to do for next time we
You don't have to do
meet.
anything. We're going to do it. I'm just prompting this so you expect this is going to happen next time. But
Okay.
our next class, I think, will be much more interactive and folks can break up into smaller groups or work independently if they so choose. And I think our goals are to sort of take some of this imagery and using Shiota and these four other artists as a way to maybe prompt other ideas, whether they are based within what you're already teaching or just to kind of explore a very new space for that. But I think it's really an exercise to really think about how we can use art as a third space to really address wider issues in our sort of educational um, framework and ecosystem, as well as sort of, address what's happening right now, right? And so I wanted to show artwork that is up now that folks can see in person. So maybe there was something amazing at the Worcester Art Museum, and you can bring the students there and have this sort of in-person experiential response to that, and then bring that back into the classroom for other sort of like personal engagements. But there's no homework, there's no need to think about this, but I just wanted to sort of plant the seed that next week we'll be sort of playing with this. So there'll be a lot of play involved, and I do think a lot of creativity and innovation involves play.
Okay. Can I follow with that too? I think I'm trying to figure out why we're using AI to create images if we're looking at artists' images that are not created with AI. I'm trying to figure out where the AI portion is in here. Is it because Clark is really interested in AI and we're just sprinkling it in, or because there are a lot of ethical concerns about the use of AI, and not just um, like
Copyright, right?
artistic ethics, but also like environmental ethics. Like I don't want
Right,
to play with
and sort of
AI because I feel like
feeding.
I'm burning a city down.
No, absolutely. I think AI for us is just a tool to sort of ease um, people's introduction into that, but they don't want to use it. So the two exercises we'll be doing next week, one is to think about different classroom exercises, prompts, assignments, and folks can do that without AI. That's totally fine. And then the second part is inviting folks to kind of design their own artworks, right? So much like last time, I really wanted to drive home that all of us are very sophisticated art sort of connoisseurs. Like we know a lot more about art than we think, regardless of our training. And so I wanted to sort of empower folks to think, you can actually make art and you can actually be a creative person. Because I hear too often people are like, oh, I like it, but I don't know how to make anything. I don't know how to draw. I don't know how to paint. And you'll notice that, besides Amy Sherald, who's like a virtuoso painter, everyone else is just sort of sourcing materials that are accessible to everybody, right? Um, and so I wanted to just sort of lower the barrier there. But Jesse, I totally hear all the complexities and concerns about AI, and it being certainly a net negative in the years to come when, there's job displacement and overconsumption of electricity and other resources, and people think of it as this sort of like passive, quirky new thing, but we haven't seen the real sinister piece of it yet. Like right now, like the robots are dancing because like look how fun they are because they're not like Terminators yet, but they'll be used for the military real soon, I'm sure. Yeah, Kayed?
Yeah, I just want to add, but before I add my comments, I want to state that I'm far away from the art as humanly possible, all types of art. So I don't understand it as much. That's why I'm very appreciative of these sessions. But the books I teach in science and computer science today, I mean, they are all coming up teaching blah, blah, blah with AI. And in every chapter and every section, after they explain a concept, they'd say, try this with AI, here's the prompt, and see what you come up with and analyze it this way or that way.
Right, and you might say that, Kayed, but you chose that shirt for a reason. Like you like that color, right? And behind you, there's some beautifully patterned thing on, might be a pillow on there. So I bet if you look, you have a stronger defined taste, more than you think, just like the way you like certain things, the way you like certain forms of architecture, and how you can kind of express that artistically, I think would be quite interesting. The AI part too is that, it's a place of dissonance for a lot of us. And, I feel multiple ways about it at the same time. I feel multiple ways about technology. I feel multiple ways about Zoom at the same time, right? Even Zoom as a platform is really fantastic, but, it's fraud. Like they're collecting our data, right? And like, that's still disempowering, but yet we wouldn't have this forum in as kind of beautiful as a manner without that. And even how there's a whole kind of artistic concept of where technology comes from. Does it come from the desire for technology, the device versus the desire, or does technology follow behavior, or how does technology create behavior, right? And so even that is so intermixed with kind of cultural understanding, and so much of technology, Kayed, as what you're saying, is so much about these cultural moments, right? And the kind of zeitgeist and the cultural value structures. So how people are programming now is so different from 5 years ago, so different from 10 years ago. So you can imagine 5 years from now, we're in this period of great acceleration. So I just feel like art is a great place to sort of collect a lot of those complexities and really share that visually together.
Right. Thank you so much. We're right up time almost. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Definitely looking forward to next week because it's going to be interactive. It'll be fun to start playing with things and see how it might work for us in our classrooms and our daily lives. Ben, thanks again.
One last thing is that it's at the ICA Watershed in East Boston. So it's a warehouse in East Boston. It's not at their main building in the Seaport District, but you can take a boat from the Seaport District building to Watershed. So all good. All right, thanks so much, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week. Take care.
Thank you, Ben. Bye, everybody.